BBC has launched what it's calling an urgent investigation into 6 journalists and a freelancer working for its Arabic language service over accusations they had shown anti-Israel bias in their coverage and expressed support on social media for Hamas. We've also, of course, seen the BBC's ongoing impartiality struggle going on pretty much ever since the start of this, and probably since before the dreadful events of October the 7th. We're going to talk now to a columnist for The Spectator, Mary Dejevsky, who's just written a piece about all of this. Good afternoon, Mary. Good to see you.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you too.
It's strange, isn't it, that we find ourselves talking so much about the BBC and how they cover various events around the world. This particular situation between Hamas and Israel and the dreadful events of October the 7th seems to have sort of polarised it even more, because we've seen the BBC having to apologise for claiming that that strike on a hospital in Gaza was an Israeli airstrike because it couldn't have been anything else. It turns out even Rishi Sunak has now said no, that it absolutely wasn't, came from inside of Gaza itself. We've seen these BBC Arabic presenters and journalists suspended because some of them actually were liking tweets which in fact glorified the Hamas attack on October the 7th. And just the general tenet of the way that interviews are conducted. We saw former Israeli Prime Minister having a go on Sunday at Victoria, Derbyshire, on the Laura Kuenssberg show. I mean, there's a pattern here which can't be denied, isn't there?
Well, I think it's, I have a certain degree of loyalty to the BBC because I began my journalistic career there with the World Service. Yeah. But I do think there's a real problem because the BBC is not just domestic broadcaster. It broadcasts all over the world. And I think, as I said in the article that you were referring to, I think maybe there is a bigger question about what it broadcasts in non-English languages. And this is where the BBC Arabic, which is what the investigation's being conducted into now, comes in. I don't know, and I think it should be left to the BBC to investigate what was actually said and broadcast, and what sort of loyalties the BBC Arabic reporters and programme makers were showing. But I think potentially there is a problem there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're reading about how a BBC team, which was later identified as being from BBC Arabic, was stopped and searched by police in Tel Aviv. These things are always very difficult. I mean, you've been in war zones, I've been in war zones. You have to be very, very level-headed when you're in those places, but you also have to understand, what the dangers are. One of the things that John Simpson said, the veteran news reporter, when he was defending the BBC's sort of steadfast refusal, really, to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. He was saying one of the reasons for that is that they have to safeguard their own people who might be operating in areas where Hamas are. Well, I get that, but I mean, everybody knows that that's the case. And considering that every other sort of news organisation in the world would describe Hamas as a terrorist group because of what they did on October the 7th alone, that's not really a defence, is it?
Well, I have to say, I have some sympathy for John Simpson's view here. I think that terrorist is, to me, terrorist is actually a narrower word than all those people demanding that the BBC describe Hamas as a terrorist organisation. It seems to me that, terrorist almost, you have the view that it's not that many people operating in the name of a bigger cause. But what happened with the Hamas, I would call them maybe fighters, on the 7th of October. That seemed to me a much bigger operation than something that would be designated terrorist.
But except if you call them fighters, it sounds like they're fighting in a war which has got a fight going on, which is not what they did. What they did was they went and massacred innocent civilians. They went and massacred people in their homes. They did atrocious things to those people. We've seen a video now from inside of Israel, glorified, if you like, and certainly, unauthenticated, in which a captured Hamas terrorist talks of being told, desecrate the bodies, do horrible things to them. They weren't fighters. Fighters sounds to me a bit more noble than what Hamas did.
No, but I have some sympathy with the BBC withholding, as it were, the word terrorist from either side. I mean, I'm just not sure that that's the right word. But it also, there's such a gigantic problem in wars, and that's really what we're looking at here, about taking sides. And you can condemn atrocities on both sides. And, I look at how the war in Ukraine has been reported, and yes, you can say, well, right is on one side. Ukraine was invaded, and the invader was Russia, and therefore we are all on the same side. But is that the best way to report things? In the Cold War, I referred to this in the article too. In the Cold War, it was really quite easy because we were all on the same side. And there was, as it were, there was a subtext, there was a propaganda line that we were on the right side and we were fighting communism, and it was the time of the Cold War. I think we're in different conditions now, and if you have the BBC, especially in a foreign language, appearing to take one side or the other, I think there is a problem for that, because the BBC's brand is impartiality.
Yes. But apparently the BBC's brand of impartiality has been already quite badly tarnished, because if you listened, as I say, to, and I think we've got the clip, let's have a look at it, Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli Prime Minister, talking to Victoria Derbyshire, he was very clear what he thought of the BBC. Let's have a look.
And I understand that BBC has taken a side of on the Gazan side, because all your questions are only about the Gazan civilians.
That's not true.
You haven't asked one question.
That's not true.
You haven't asked one question about those children. From the very beginning of this interview, you just are asking me about them.
Mr. Bennett,
it seems
that
you
is
care
not true.
little about our side. Oh, it is.
Mr. Bennett, I began by talking about the hostages. And what I'm asking you about now is...
No, I'm not talking about the hostages. I'm talking about the babies that were murdered. And you keep on caring only about one side, but that is the BBC way. But let me tell you something. We're here protecting you. We don't need your protection.
I mean, pretty damning words there from a former Prime Minister. I mean, he's not an insignificant figure. And I think I take your point that, the BBC should strive to be impartial. But it would appear that around the world, they're not seen as impartial. They're seen as actually partial in a different direction. And very much so from the point of view of what's come out of the BBC and the way that BBC Arabic has behaved, it would appear that they would be on the side of the Palestinians, not Hamas, but of the Palestinians, as opposed to the side of Israel. That's how it comes across. And I think that's very damaging to the BBC.
No, I agree, absolutely. And I think that the BBC has to be very, very careful of its impartiality. And I think it's unfortunate that in that particular interview that you've just shown a section of, the BBC, I mean, Victoria Derbyshire was very much thrown back on the defensive. Yeah. And that's not a good position for the BBC to be in either. But my particular concern has been about editorial control and direction of what's broadcast in the name of the BBC in foreign languages. I think if they're broadcasting in English, then it's much easier around the world, maybe to keep a bit of distance, but also for the editors to know what's going out in their name. Once they start broadcasting foreign languages, and the BBC has Arabic television, I would say there's maybe a particular problem with television as opposed to radio, but actually keeping tabs on what people are saying and doing with the BBC brand, as it were, all over it. Yeah. I think that's something that really has to be looked at more carefully.
Yeah. Oh, I think like many things in the BBC, because it's such a large and difficult organisation to manage, I think they can't keep their eyes on everything. And I'm sure that BBC executives in London were horrified when they saw that members of their teams in BBC Arabic were actually liking tweets which appeared to be welcoming the Hamas invasion of Western Israel, and the massacre that took place. Similarly, I mean, I've known, as I'm sure you have, people that worked in the World Service. Over the years, I was associated with media in this country which was aimed at the Asian population, and I knew quite a lot of the people that worked in the Urdu service at the World Service at Bush House, and it was very tribal. You know, and an awful lot of the people, because the BBC sort of managers didn't really have a clue, they'd sort of give carte blanche almost to certain individuals to go and do broadcasting in Urdu to Pakistan or in Hindi to some of the BBC outlets in India. And incredible kind of, partnerships were forged, unbeknownst, as far as I know, to the BBC, where only certain kind of representations were made in those broadcasts. And I'm not accusing the BBC of negligence here, but, I think they just didn't have their eye on the ball. They weren't sure what was going on.
Mm. But you see, it's extraordinarily difficult to get to keep your eye on the ball all the time. And I just wonder whether, I mean, the BBC is in quite a sort of ambiguous position in a lot of ways, because it claims to be, at one remove, because of the license fee, it claims to be at one remove at least from the government. But when it broadcasts abroad, it's seen as an arm of the government, like it or not. And when you look at other foreign broadcasters, for instance, France 24 or Deutsche Welle or Germany, they broadcast in several foreign languages, including on television. They broadcast in Arabic, as well as French or German, their own language, and in English. And they are absolutely upfront about how they're funded, and the fact that funding comes from Deutsche Welle, for Deutsche Welle from the state, and for France 24 at least partly from the state. And the BBC keeps this, it takes a rather superior attitude to this and says we're independent of the state. I think in broadcasting abroad, even though the funding model has changed over the years, really, maybe the BBC should say and be funded in a way that makes it clear that it actually is an arm of the state when it broadcasts abroad.
Right, because, there are no doubt conversations that are had between top brass at the BBC and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, because that would go without saying. The World Service is one of the things, I suppose, that's been the least changed in the last, say, 5 years, given the way that conversations are going on about the BBC licence fee, whether it should be changed, whether the model should change, whereas the World Service still very much seen, as far as I know, as a bit of an arm of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is despite the fact that quite a lot of the funding for the World Service was actually transferred to the license fee, I think about 10 years ago. And in some ways, I thought that was quite a good thing, because it meant that the BBC could actually deny that it was an arm of government. Yeah. But since then, there've been sort of discretionary grants and extra payments for extra services, including, for instance, like broadcasting in Ukraine, obviously, after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. So the other thing is that the model, I think, which is not sometimes appreciated, the model for BBC World, the television service, that is funded largely from advertising, whereas the foreign language radio services are currently funded partly out of the license fee and partly out of these discretionary grants from the Foreign Office. And that puts, BBC World, the television service in English, is therefore in a different situation editorially from the World Service radio or from the home services.
Yeah. But it's possible, isn't it, though, Mary, in the end, to be able to make a judgment about an act. So, for example, if you didn't want to call Hamas terrorists, you could still see what they had done was terrorist activity, and in that situation, you call them terrorists, in the same way that you don't have to be on the side of Ukraine to see that an invasion by Russia into Ukraine is wrong. And therefore, you can argue the toss about, the history of the whole project and the history of the two countries and all of that, but, an incursion into a foreign country, a foreign state, a sovereign state, is clearly not the best way to proceed. And so, therefore, you can still take the side of Ukraine initially and say that the Russians are the aggressors.
No, absolutely. I mean, you have to say that in the light of the facts. But what I worry about is what you've alluded to too, which is that you have different versions being put out for different audiences in different languages, and I think that's really not a good idea, and that it's perfectly possible in this day and age with all the facilities of digital, the internet, satellite television, for some of those individual services actually to be spun off by the BBC, not to be broadcasting in the name of the BBC, but to be broadcasting in the name of whatever side or whatever cause they're representing. And if they want to represent, if you have, as it were, a group of people who want to broadcast in say Arabic, and particularly in the name of the Palestinian cause, well, that's absolutely fine. But should that be funded by the BBC? I sort of think it shouldn't be.
Absolutely. Mary, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Mary Dejevsky there, who's written a piece in the Spectator about the problem for the BBC. And no doubt the problem is BBC made and BBC manufactured and BBC solvable. It's quite simple. Hamas are terrorists. It's that easy. That's all you have to do. You don't have to write a memo, you don't have to send an email. You just have to know this is what they do and this is what they are. It's that simple.